In this episode, we're going to bring together three ideas that sit at the heart of modern privacy work: accountability, fairness, and transparency. Accountability means the organization can explain what it does with personal information, prove it follows its own rules, and correct problems when it discovers them. Fairness means people are treated in a way that avoids unjust harm, avoids hidden manipulation, and avoids outcomes that systematically disadvantage certain individuals or groups. Transparency means people are not left guessing about what happens to their data. They receive clear information that matches reality at moments when the information is useful. For brand new learners, the key shift is seeing these as life cycle properties, not as one-time promises. It is easy to be transparent at sign-up and then become opaque as data flows to analytics and vendors. It is easy to write an accountability policy and then fail to collect evidence when decisions are made. It is easy to claim fairness and then deploy processes that quietly produce biased outcomes. Promoting these values across the full data lifecycle means designing consistent behaviors from collection through deletion, so the organization's privacy posture is not a patchwork of good intentions. Start by understanding why the life cycle matters, because accountability, fairness, and transparency each fail most often in the transitions between life cycle stages. Collection is where expectations are formed and where overcollection can create unnecessary exposure. Use is where purpose can drift, where data can be repurposed, and where automated decisions can affect people's lives. Sharing is where control expands beyond the original team and where vendors can introduce new risks and new uses. Storage is where access control and logging determine whether the organization can detect misuse and prove proper behavior. Retention and deletion are where organizations often break their promises by keeping data long after the purpose ends, increasing risk and undermining trust. Promoting these values across the life cycle means asking at every stage: can we explain what we are doing? Is it fair to the people involved? And are we being honest and clear about it? For beginners, it helps to think of privacy as a story the organization tells and lives out over time, not as a legal notice displayed once. When the story stays consistent, trust grows. When the story changes without warning, trust collapses. Accountability begins with ownership, because an organization cannot be accountable if no one is responsible for decisions. Ownership in privacy does not mean one person holds all data. It means that for each dataset and major process, there is a defined role accountable for purpose, access, retention, and sharing decisions. Accountability also requires documentation of decisions, because if the organization cannot show why it collected data or why it shared data, it cannot defend its actions under scrutiny. Evidence matters too, meaning logs, records, approvals, and assessments that show controls are operating. A beginner mistake is to assume accountability is achieved when a policy exists, but policies do not produce evidence automatically. A mature approach builds accountability into workflows, such as requiring justification and approvals when new data elements are added or when data is used for a new purpose. It also includes monitoring so leadership can see whether accountability practices are actually occurring. Promoting accountability across the life cycle, therefore, means making responsible decision-making visible, repeatable, and reviewable. Transparency is closely tied to accountability, because transparency requires knowing what you are doing before you can explain it. Transparency starts at collection, where people should be told what is collected and why in plain language that matches what they are doing. It continues through use and sharing, where notices and choices should reflect reality, not vague statements designed to cover everything. Transparency also includes making privacy controls understandable, such as explaining how preferences are honored and how rights requests can be made. For beginners, a useful principle is that transparency should reduce surprise, because surprise is often what drives complaints and distrust. A program might technically disclose broad categories of use, but if people still feel shocked when they discover how their data was used, transparency failed in practice. Promoting transparency across the life cycle means updating notices when practices change, communicating in context rather than burying information, and ensuring that internal teams do not expand uses quietly without revisiting external promises. It also means avoiding confusing choices that look like choice but do not meaningfully change data handling. Fairness is the third pillar, and it often feels less concrete than accountability and transparency until you connect it to real decisions made with data. Fairness includes avoiding discrimination and avoiding outcomes that systematically harm certain groups. But it also includes avoiding manipulative practices that take advantage of people's limited understanding. Fairness matters across the life cycle because unfairness can be introduced at collection, such as asking invasive questions that are not necessary. And it can be introduced during use, such as using data to make decisions without giving people meaningful ways to understand or challenge those decisions. Fairness is also threatened by inaccuracies, because wrong data can lead to wrong conclusions, and people may not know how to correct it. Another fairness concern is power imbalance, such as employees being monitored without meaningful choice or customers being forced to accept broad data use to access essential services. Promoting fairness means being intentional about how data affects people, especially when decisions are automated or when data is used to categorize people into segments. For beginners, fairness is easiest to grasp when you ask whether a practice would feel acceptable if you were on the receiving end and had limited ability to opt out. Across the collection stage, promoting all three pillars starts with minimization and clarity. Collect only what is needed for a defined purpose, because collecting extra data creates risk and often feels unfair. Be transparent at the moment of collection, using clear explanations that match the context rather than dense legal language. Use defaults that protect people by limiting unnecessary tracking unless there is a clear reason and a meaningful choice. Accountability at collection means documenting why each major data element is collected and who approved that decision, so the organization can explain it later. Fairness at collection means avoiding coercive patterns, such as making optional data appear mandatory or asking sensitive questions without a strong justification. These practices set the tone for the rest of the life cycle because the collection stage determines what data exists and what expectations people form. When collection is restrained and honest, downstream stages start from a healthier foundation. During use, promoting accountability, fairness, and transparency requires controlling purpose drift and being honest about decisions made with data. Accountability means defining permissible uses, documenting new uses when they appear, and ensuring approval and review processes actually occur. Transparency means communicating significant uses that affect people in meaningful ways, especially when data is used for profiling or targeted experiences. Fairness means examining how uses affect different people and whether the use could lead to exclusion, manipulation, or unequal treatment. It also means considering explainability, which is the ability to describe why a decision was made, at least at a high level, so people are not trapped by a black box outcome. Use stage fairness also includes limiting unnecessary precision, because overly detailed tracking can create invasive profiles that go beyond what people would reasonably expect. Promoting these pillars at use time is about ensuring data serves legitimate purposes without turning individuals into objects of analysis with no agency. This is where privacy becomes closely tied to ethics and user trust. Sharing is where the organization's promises are most likely to be tested, because sharing expands who can access data and how it can be used. Accountability in sharing means having clear rules and approvals, documenting who receives data and for what purpose, and maintaining evidence that vendors and partners meet their obligations. Transparency in sharing means ensuring people are not surprised by third-party involvement, especially when the sharing changes the nature of the relationship. Fairness in sharing means minimizing what is shared, limiting use to what is necessary, and avoiding arrangements that exploit data subjects for the benefit of others without meaningful benefit or choice. Sharing also requires thinking about onward sharing, meaning whether the recipient can pass data to additional parties, which can quickly erode control and increase harm. Promoting the pillars here means treating sharing as a high-impact decision point rather than a routine operational detail. It also means ensuring that when data moves outside the organization still knows what happens and can act when problems arise. Storage, access, and monitoring are where accountability becomes measurable, because these are the mechanisms that produce evidence of proper behavior. Accountability requires access control that matches roles, so sensitive data is not accessible broadly. It requires monitoring that can detect unusual access patterns and support investigations when something seems wrong. Transparency benefits here too because accurate external disclosures depend on knowing where data resides and how it is protected. Fairness is relevant because access misuse can lead to targeted harm, and because poor data quality can lead to unfair outcomes when decisions are based on inaccurate records. Storage practices also affect the ability to honor rights, because if data is scattered across systems, it becomes hard to provide access reports or delete reliably. Promoting the pillars at this stage means designing storage and access as privacy controls, not only as technical architecture decisions. It also means reducing the number of copies and controlling where personal information is allowed to exist, because fewer copies make accountability and transparency easier. Retention and deletion are often where accountability is most visibly tested, because people and regulators care whether an organization keeps data longer than necessary. Accountability means defining retention periods, tying them to purpose and obligations, and proving deletion happens when the period ends. Transparency means being honest about how long data is kept and what deletion means in different environments like backups, so people are not misled. Fairness means not holding data indefinitely in ways that increase risk without benefit to the individual, and not using old data to make decisions that no longer reflect a person's current reality. Retention also affects fairness when old inaccuracies persist and continue to influence outcomes. Promoting these pillars requires building deletion and retention into routine operations, with ownership and monitoring, rather than treating deletion as an occasional cleanup. This stage is also where minimization shows its long-term power. Collecting less and keeping less reduces exposure and makes the program more trustworthy. As we close, remember that Task 19 is about making accountability, fairness, and transparency consistent properties of the entire data lifecycle, not isolated promises. Accountability means clear ownership, documented decisions, and evidence that controls operate from collection through deletion. Transparency means clear, context-appropriate communication and choices that match reality, so people are not surprised as data is used and shared over time. Fairness means being intentional about how data practices affect individuals and groups, avoiding manipulation, discrimination, and hidden harms, and ensuring decisions based on data remain justifiable and correctable. Promoting these pillars requires tying them to concrete practices at each life cycle stage: restrained collection, purpose-controlled use, careful sharing, controlled storage and access, and disciplined retention and deletion. When these values are promoted consistently, privacy becomes a lived practice that reduces harm and builds trust, and the organization becomes more resilient to change and scrutiny. That is the ultimate goal of a strong privacy program, and why Task 19 sits as a capstone skill for privacy governance and engineering work.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.